It's now my pleasure for us to start our first plenary of the morning, Bright Spots in Building Healthy Workplace Cultures. It's my honor to invite up our moderator, Nicole Nevarez, founding CEO of Tom Mode, and our two panelists, Ayana Morse, Executive Director of Svara, and Whitney Weathers, Managing Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice at Upstart.
Thank you so much, Shana. Thank you, Rabba. That was absolutely beautiful. Shana spoke about how we would start today to begin to glean some tools, tangible tools that we can bring into our work to begin to, or continue to, or strengthen the work of safety, respect, and equity within our organizations. And I feel like in that Devar, we already began with some tangible tools. So I think we'll just take a quick moment to introduce ourselves. So again, I'm Nicole Nevarez. I'm wearing a pretty hot pink top. I have brown hair.
I'm Ayana Morse. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing large glasses. I have dark shoulder length hair, and I'm wearing a black sweater dress and pants.
Hey, I'm Whitney Weathers. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in all black, and my hair is fabulously braided, and I have red lipstick on.
And I forgot my pronouns. Thank you. Also she, her. So we're hoping today, throughout the day and beginning this morning, to begin to talk about some tactical, tangible ways that we can do this work. And we're going to do that this morning by talking a bit about what that looks like and how each of us do that within our own organization. I want to name something that has sort of came up yesterday and was said again today, that this work very often, it can be hard to focus on the work of culture because it feels like there's so much other urgency, and particularly at this moment, that is an additional. We are in a totally, unprecedented for our generation, not for the Jewish people, but moment of that sense of urgency. And I just want to reiterate something that I already heard this morning, which is that we can't do the work of creating safety and wellness and strength in the world when we're not in a space of safety and wellness and strength at home. And so while it can seem for some that this is a moment where, like, how can we focus on culture? We have so much global urgency, but that actually it's very much the opposite, that the stronger, the healthier, the more human-centered and supported our organizations are, the better we will be able to face the moment that we're in. So let's talk for a minute about why culture matters. Like, why does culture matter? Which probably to this group is fairly obvious. But the moment that SRE started was the moment of Me Too going viral. And what we understand and we know from deep amounts of research across all the sectors of workplace world globally is that the number one predictor of harassment and discrimination in organizational spaces is culture. Right? That there's not actually another reason those things happen, but it's when we allow the culture of an organization to be unsafe in all kinds of ways that seem sort of less egregious, we end up in a environment that has much more high risk of harassment and discrimination and abuse. And it happens whether you pay attention or not. Culture happens whether you pay attention or not, right? So it's going to develop with intentionality or not. And we also know, of course, that our bottom lines are deeply impacted by our culture. And when we say bottom line, for some of us, for all of us, there's a fiscal bottom line. But for most of us, if not all of us as mission-driven organizations, we're also talking about the work that we're trying to do in the world being impacted, and that impact being reduced when our cultures are not safe and whole. So what do we even mean when we're talking about organizational wellness? For us, our foundational understanding is that we're talking about deep, rife psychological safety, clear policies and procedures, but a human-centered culture where everybody knows that they can show up with their full selves at work, where we think about and focus on the humanness of those in our organizations, and then we think about the work that we do. And in order to do that, we need to create a shared language. And when we do have that shared language as a larger community, and as individual organizations, we are more well equipped to do this work and to learn from that collective experience what's worked and what doesn't work. So at Talmud, we use Amy Edmondson's definition of psychological safety, which is that it's a climate characterized by by interpersonal trust, mutual respect, and where people are comfortable being themselves. And so we want to be really clear, and I know that my colleagues will speak to this, it's not about organizational culture that's free from conflict. In fact, conflict-free organizations are not only that's not a thing because humans are messy, right? And humans are humans, but also we know that when you look at team building, conflict actually goes up as teams trust each other more, right? Because it means that people feel safe to challenge and people feel safe to bring their perspectives and their questions to an organization and to a community. So in order to do this, though, we also have to understand power and identity. We cannot have psychological safety if we don't understand that entering into every space in the world, every room that we walk into, there are multiple vectors of power at play, that social construct, that identity, gender, race, positional power are always in the room in multiple ways, and that in order to have real psychological safety, we need to be aware of that and understand the way that it interacts within our organizations, amongst individuals, and with each other. The last thing I'll say before we sort of jump into a conversation is that we do have a tendency often to, in our organizations, and at Talmud we see this all the time because we work with organizations out in the community. We see that this can be very much put down lower on our priority list because of that sense of urgency that we feel to meet our mission values. So I want to argue two things. One is that focusing on our culture is a mission value, that we can't actually be in our integrity in the mission of our organizations if we're doing it at the expense of the individuals who are doing that work and if they're being harmed. And the other is that it actually is, I don't know if easier than we think is the right word. Easier, but simpler. Let's call it simpler. Easy and simple are not the same thing. But that even when budget is a challenge or we're working with very tiny staff, or I know many of you have entirely remote staff at this point, we can really still be coming from a place of that human-centeredness, and small acts can have a really, really big impact. Budgets don't have to be a barrier. Remote and size don't have to be a barrier. There are answers and tools, some of which you'll learn about today. So let's open with a question. So Ayana, why don't we start with you? How do you define a healthy workplace culture? What are the components? What does it look like and feel like for you?
First, I just want to say what an honor to get to be with you all and to get to be thinking together in furthering this dreaming that is no longer intangible. It is increasingly tangible in our workplaces, in our environments. So what a gift. At Svara, we're a yeshiva that centers queer and trans voices, and increasingly our community and our staff are over 50% disabled as well. So we're working with a group of people who hold multiple underrepresented identities all the time. And our approach in our learning and also behind the scenes for our team is really about empowerment and about unlocking tools to make Jewish tradition our own and also to make work an autonomous, healthy place. And I think this idea of how do our insides match our outsides, which is something that Whitney, Nicole, and I have been talking about in the lead up to this conversation, right? How do you look at the way that you're serving your community and make sure that you're also tending on the inside in the same way with the same care? So I think that's for us the foundation. And then I also just want to note that the tending of culture is forever work. Right, whenever you start it, it's actually already in the middle and it doesn't end. So remembering at different moments when you need to bring more acute care, more acute tending, and when you have enough baseline to sort of say, okay, like this is not the acute day to pay attention to this. Either way, it's happening. And that's really important.
Thank you. Whitney?
Yeah. I have a fidget because I'm nervous, so y'all just bear with me. How do you define a healthy workplace culture? I define it by looking at the person that has the most marginalized identity and mapping their experience. So at Upstart, 40% of our staff identify as having a disability, and 30% of our staff identify as non-Jewish. We have another 30% of our staff that represent people of color. And so typically I am asking, and 40% of our staff that identify as being a part of the LGBTQIA+ community. So I am constantly asking, what is happening with them in terms of their retention, their promotion, and their pay? What is their experience? I have an education background. So we used to say an accommodation for a student with a need is usually good for everyone.
Right.
Like there's very rarely a time where we say, let's send out the agenda ahead of time, and somebody neurotypical is like, damn, I hate it when y'all send out the agenda, right? Like, that's just not something that happens. So typically I say, who's the most marginalized person on our staff? What is happening for them? And if they are healthy, if they are thriving, if their experience is one that they tell others about, then I say, okay, now we're moving towards a healthy place. And that is not exclusionary. One of the things that I want to say about my purview and my talk and our talk today is that it might scratch you. At Upstart, we have this norm that you can scratch without being injured, which means that your mind can be pushed about something without you taking it offensively. So if you are in this room and you came in here like, I ain't got the budget, I ain't got the people, I don't want to, like, hold space for that and lean into the fact that you can be scratched without being injured. So when you hear me say I'm looking at the most marginalized person's identity, that is not exclusionary to you. That is not exclusionary to your staff. That is instead me saying, how do we flip what we see as normal and what we see as standard, and how do we use that to drive towards greater diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice?
Thank you. I will share also that at Talmud, we have a very limited budget, and we have a very tiny staff, and we're all remote. And the thing that I'm the most proud of is that every person who has come through our staff, be they actual day-to-day staff or the bench of trainers that we work with as contractors, we receive feedback again and again and again that it is the most whole, well supported, right, that they have experienced feeling. And not only, and again, remember I said very limited budget, so while we do everything we can to be as equitable as we can with pay and benefits and all of those pieces, what they're responding to is less that and more the experience of being seen as a whole person, more the experience of being able to get on a call and saying, you know, I had a really rough night and I'm not my full self this morning, and knowing they can bring that to a meeting and we're gonna say, okay, great, how can we hold you? Or maybe do you need to skip the meeting, right? As well as, you know, just those basic ways of showing up. And I love what you said about looking at the most marginalized identity. I know for me in my journey of understanding equity on an infinitely deeper and more wide scale basis over the last, I would say 5 years, I now begin to walk into a room and see things differently. You and I have talked about this a lot, that we often walk into a room and we sort of immediately start to catch the things that might impact an identity other than ours. And that's a muscle that all of us can build. It's rooted in empathy, and think about all the things you've learned in your life. Like, we can begin to really start to think and see things differently. I actually want to share super briefly a story that I heard in our little group yesterday, our small groups, and I was with the small orgs directors, and one of my colleagues was sharing that she's over 50 and has come into an organization that was started by much younger folks, and that they are essentially schooling her on some organizational culture norms that for them are just non-negotiable, right? And like, she's listening and learning and making some changes accordingly. That's an extraordinary, that was an extraordinary example of the ways that we can really build psychologically safe, healthy culture where people feel seen. And I just want to be clear also that that also includes policies and procedures, right? And making sure that all those beautiful boundaries that Rabbi Svara was just teaching about are also met, right? We're not just talking about having like a really wonderful environment where everybody loves each other. Like, first of all, that's not a thing, and you don't have to love each other to have psychological safety either. But also, you know, that those policies and procedures are in place and people know where to go. Every single person in your organization should know, who do I report to if I have a problem? Whether that problem is that, you know, there's strife going on in an email exchange, or I think there may actually be harassment, or I experience discrimination or abuse. Who do I go to? And if that person's not safe for me because it's my supervisor, who's the next person that I go to? Where do those policies and procedures live? All of this should be transparent and clear for everyone, along with that day-to-day building of culture that's always happening, right? And that we're always paying attention to. We teach a Hineni frame at Talmud that's all about like being in the present with ourselves and for our organizations is the only way that we continue to do this work consistently. So let's talk about, I just shared a little bit about some of our practices. Let's talk about some of your practices of how you actually bring this to life. I think you both began to share a bit about that. And in general, and also if you have something to share about the Zoom culture that we live in and the ways that we can do that in remote workplaces, and even not remote workplaces, but on Zoom with our colleagues all the time. Do you want? You two decide.
Let's not do rock, paper, scissors in front of all these people. Upstart's 100% remote. We span 4 different time zones. And so we definitely look at belongingness differently because we are a remote culture. I want to tap on something that Nicole said. At Upstart, once a month, we have something called a team talk. Nicole said yes.
Because it's amazing.
So, see, that's way too much pressure. See, I'm already like, once a month, we have something called a team talk. And one of the things that occurred to me as a Black Christian woman who works in the Jewish ecosystem, I've never had a corporate job in my life, right? I was a teacher, and I was a teacher. So then I get to this corporate job and they're like, here's your credit card and here's your this and here's your that. And this is in speak. And I'm just like, I don't know what these people talking about. I didn't know how to negotiate a salary. They underpaid me. I didn't know any of those things. And there was an assumption that I would know those things. And so I took that experience and I said, I don't want any other person, especially a person of color, to experience what I experienced. And so we instituted something called a team talk. What it is we take an element of our handbook and we take an hour and we review it with our staff and we do an open Q&A. Because although I know all of you sleep with your handbooks by your nightstand, for some easy reading, I definitely do not do that. And no one taught me to do that, right? And that's a lot of the things that we take for granted. At Upstart, one of our DEIJ goals is to remove barriers and create opportunities for people from historically underrepresented identities. And you don't know what a barrier is until you're already facing it. Mm-hmm. And so in our team talks, we talk about how to advocate for what our compensation philosophy is, where to find it, what our pay bands are, where to find it, how to request time off. We go through our evaluation process, and it's a really agile thing. So we start with like a frame of what we want the team talks to be, but we also use like our leading edge survey data and other anecdotal data to determine what we should talk about. And we have people say to us, I've never had an organization explain the handbook to me. And of course, one of the questions is why not? And the other question is, why not, right? So that's a very tactical way that we try to bring transparency to our practices. We use team talks, which are optional, for people to learn more about the organization. Something else that I'll say in remote culture, we have we do 2 things. So one, we don't have ERGs in person, but we have affinity-based Slack channels. So another thing, I was like—
Whitney, what's an ERG?
I got you. An employee resource group and affinity spaces are sacred spaces and safe spaces for people with various identities. I just so happen to belong to most of the groups because, ND Support and Solidarity, POC Like Me, and Moms of Upstart are 3 of the channels that we have. They are private, and you have to be invited. And in those channels, we have conversations about things that we are struggling with. And again, don't be scratched by, well, how do I know what you're talking about? Ask yourself, why do you need to know? Right? What we talk about in those channels are what we talk about based on our identities. I'll, transparently say one day I was like, y'all, my brain hurts and I think it's Tuesday, and someone was like, yeah, cool, it's Wednesday. But that's like ND Support and Solidarity, Neurodivergent Support and Solidarity. I am neurodivergent, and there are things that I cannot say to my neurotypical peers that I can safely say within that channel, right? I can say, y'all, I'm food fixating. I've eaten eggs 6 days in a row, and I know y'all won't judge me. So those are things that exist at Upstart, that Upstart has helped create the space for in order to help our employees feel more supported.
Thank you, Whitney. Ayana? Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. She's kind of amazing.
I know. It's true. 2 things are coming up for me as practices that we do. One is that we developed community norms towards the beginning of the shutdown at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we did that because we knew that we needed to create a container to hold our community and to hold ourselves. And that showing up on Zoom is not the same as showing up in physical 3-dimensional space. And you gain different cues and you miss different cues. So we developed this set of norms that are sort of the baseline of how you show up to space at Svara, and our staff is accountable to them and our community is accountable to them, and they're the same in both directions. And we review them periodically and update them because, again, culture tending is not static work, right? And something you wrote in 2020 is not going to be the same truth as it is in 2024. And one of the things that came up in our justice and equity group when we were reviewing the accountability practices was that to us feels like the most important of the community norms, right? How we're accountable to each other, how we're accountable to the work and to the community. And that's the part of our norms that outlines our practices around harm, our practices around reporting, not in a deep legally handbook kind of way, right. In a understandable language kind of way. And it lists out, if you're in a learning space, here's who you talk to. And if you experience a microaggression, this is what you do. And it really tries to look at a lot of different scenarios without being so prescriptive that you can't make space. And as we've been increasingly at Svara talking about communal partnership and how we might look to open up as an organizational partner in different ways, one of the things that came up is this idea of transparent accountability and those practices in other organizations as a really important baseline to us that we look for, because it tells us that that organization is doing that work, right? That culture tending work. And without that, you just don't know. And you can ask and have conversation, but if it isn't there, if it isn't findable, that's a flag for us.
Oh, I want to tag onto that. When I first got to Upstart, our evaluation process, I was like, hey, how do people get evaluated? And they're like, cool. I don't know. So it was like a problem because it changed year to year. No, that was actual footage of a conversation I had. So I was like, that's not a thing. It's just the supervisor's input. Like, you didn't even do a self-reflection. Everybody didn't do a self-reflection as part of the process. So the first thing I did is I said, can we please have a self-reflection and peer reviews as a part of the evaluation process? One of the things that we understand about agency, especially for people of color, is that we are typically led by someone who does not look like us, right? I don't remember the last time I had a person of color that was my supervisor. And so I was getting feedback from that person without being able to have any say in that. And so we do peer reviews at Upstart where you get to pick 2 people that give feedback based on your performance. Scratch, well, what if they just pick people that like them? what if they do? Like, you know, like, I'm glad you got two people that like you. So like, I think like that is also a way that we sort of add agency back, right? You get to pick two people to give feedback that you have worked with. We're a 22-person or between 18 and 22-person organization. You're not that far removed from someone's portfolio, but consider how many, you'll hear me use the analogy all the time. You'll hear me because we're going to talk for the rest of our lives. You'll hear me use the analogy like putting coins in the bank. So sometimes I say, does this action put coins in the bank or does it make a withdrawal? And at our the thing that we try to do is continually add coins in the bank, not because we know we're not going to make a withdrawal, but because we want to be more strategic about the things that make the withdrawal. We don't want to accidentally take somebody's money out of their bank account, right? Something else in terms of transparency and norms is we redid our values because we found that they were a little bit too generic. It was like excitement and risk taking, and we were like, there is no accountability for that. Our first value is driven by Jewish wisdom, ethics, and values. That's the first value. And then the second one is to be radically human-centered. We want to go above and beyond. We want people to think there's something wrong with us because we are so radically human-centered. Now, we do that better in some spaces than others, but the bottom line is if your values are generic and people don't necessarily know how to action them, much to my colleague's statement, then you should probably start there.
Yeah. I want to just, I want to just pick up on you know, I keep thinking about something that I actually heard quite some time ago at a JCC Association national board meeting where I was teaching, and somebody who is representative on the board got up to talk about the bylaws, and he talked about thinking about bylaws, and I will say in this case policies and procedures and norms and the ways that we approach our culture as very much the way we approach Torah and Talmud text, the way we approach deep Jewish text, that we are constantly turning it and reinterpreting and reinterpreting. And I hear you both, and I know this is how we approach it also at Talmud, saying that very much, that it is alive, it is moving, it is agile. I love what you just said about like, we want people to think something's wrong with us, right? Because that is what we come up against. We have so much scarcity mentality in our world and in our community in particular, and that we come up against but if we put so much time, energy, and resource toward this, there won't be enough over here. And one of those things, you know, to scratch without getting injured is to be able to push, especially those of you in the room who have actual agency around culture in your organizations, who have power around those culture decisions, right? To be able to say like, this is really uncomfortable, and I'm gonna trust that I'm gonna put this dollar or this hour or this amount of energy, because it's finite for all of us, toward this human-centeredness, toward this culture issue. We're gonna pause. This is something we really, really don't like to do in our community. We're gonna slow down. We're gonna put this on pause. We're not gonna do 3 programs, we're gonna do 2, because 2, we're gonna do better and the people will have a better experience getting there, right? We don't like that in the Jewish community for the most part. And so in order to, you know, have that, I just love that idea. We want people to think something's wrong with us, right? Because it is somewhat countercultural. We teach always, no matter what we're doing, a workshop, a series, a whole training, the first slide of every single thing we do is culture equals mission, right? That we have to be allocating as much resource to culture and mission. I want to say one more thing and jump to you, Ayana, about the feedback, that like feedback-rich culture also across research, across sectors, like look up workplace wellness, and within 2 minutes, you're gonna see feedback-rich culture. And what that means is exactly what Whitney described at Upstart, is that it is a constant feedback loop, right? You should never be getting to an evaluation where you are hearing something new. First of all, I would personally and professionally, I would say eliminate evaluations. We do what we call a cheshbon, or a personal, like, oh God, someone help me translate. Thank you, an accounting, that is the word I was looking for, right? We do an accounting, that's what we call our evaluation process. It's a cheshbon. It is done first, the person, both the supervisor and the supervisee, write, and then we share it with each other, and then we come in and discuss it. It is an opportunity to ask a meta question of how's it going? for everybody, right? But there should be nothing in that cheshbon moment that we haven't already discussed because we're in such a constant state of a feedback loop.
Absolutely.
You wanted to share.
Yeah, and just really building, I think, on what you're both offering. I think we've sort of implicitly touched on how culture is co-created, right? And I want to just spend a minute on how explicitly that is so important in creating healthy workplaces. At Svara, we call evaluations reflections. And the tool that we use is a tool that our whole team came together to create as a group. And we looked at our organizational values and broke them down into how can we be accountable to these values, right? What does that look like to hold ourselves accountable to the values of our organization? And everybody contributed on the team, and they weren't finished until every person sort of agreed to them or committed to holding themselves and each other accountable to them. And I think that shift, right, it's not a top-down situation where you're like, this is how you're doing, right? It's like, we are all in this together, and we know what we're in together. And then, of course, there's self-reflection to be able to look at those values and to look at that grid and see yourself in that, and see where you think you want to grow and where you think you're excelling in that space, right? The other thing I want to touch on that you were just speaking about, this idea of slowing down and this shift away from just being in a hustle culture and being in urgency all the time. At Svara, we take 3 different, at least 1 week, often longer, pauses, right? Collective office closures.
So do we.
And that's in addition to our unlimited PTO policy. And we
Same.
do
So do we.
audits
So does Upstart.
on the unlimited PTO so that folks who aren't taking enough time off are encouraged to take more. And it's not a shameful, bad news process. And it's not only the people at the top of a hierarchy who are taking a majority of the time off, right? We're really looking at how can we all be supporting each other's rest and care.
I'll add to that we know that there is a model in organizations that have unlimited PTO, unlimited
Paid
time off. I'm like, what's the P? That often they don't take it, but also that it is incredibly, incredibly critical for the top leadership in organizations to model this, that we see time and again, that no matter how many times as leaders we tell our people, no, it's real, we really do, you really should. If we're not doing it ourselves, it really deeply impacts them. And when we had our very first really full-time staff person, I had a situation where I took vacation. I was on vacation for 2 weeks. I'm very guarded and protected about my vacation. I turn off my email. Like, I'm very good about it. I don't like that word, but I'm very committed to it. And in this one instance, there was something happening in a teeny tiny organization that was growing. So it was me and another person where I had to attend to something for literally probably a sum total of an hour on 2 weeks of vacation. But it meant my staff person had to call me because it was about money. I was the only one who could deal with it, et cetera. And at some point, I just got this little sense that I should say to them, I want to just name that you're watching me work on vacation. And this is not how it goes. You know this isn't how it goes. I've told you a million times, but I want to just name that that's happening, and it might bring up a question for you. And I was actually shocked, but they said to me, I'm so grateful that you said that, because I was actually kind of thinking, is this going to be expected of me next time I go on vacation? So that's how critical it is for our leadership to be walking our talk and really, living our values and know that it matters and it works. We're gonna have to wrap up in a minute, so I'm gonna ask you to share, and then I have one more thing for you guys. You friends.
Tactically, we close between December 25th and January 1st. We also close the whole week of Thanksgiving. and then we close for the entire portion of Passover.
So do we.
And this is why we had staff, because we have unlimited DTO, we had staff members who were taking the time off anyway, right? And so what we found, again, looking at the person that has the most underrepresented identity, our Orthodox staff member was stressed out when she would return, because all of us would be working and she would be taking care of her family and her culture and holding sacred to her spirituality. Meanwhile, she would come back to 100 Slack messages and emails.
Right.
And so when we looked at her experience, we said, what is it that she would need in order to feel most supported? Many of our other staff members were already taking time off anyway. And so finally I said to our administration, or our executive leadership team, I said, look, we only had 5 people in the office for the entire time.
Yeah.
Can we please just take the time
Right.
off?
Yeah.
Especially with Thanksgiving, we were all in different school systems. Our parents were taking the entire week because they just didn't have childcare.
Right.
So again, in terms of agility,
Yes.
you have to ask yourselves, who was the archetype when we created the
Yes.
policy? And is that archetype still applicable to the needs of our organization?
Yes.
And if you can ask yourself those questions, then you can begin to create really, really good change across your organization. And
absolutely.
the archetype isn't going to be the same.
Right. And that flexibility and that nimbleness to keep turning it and turning it.
Because everything's already in it.
Right, and things are changing. Our culture internally needs to be responsive to the culture externally also, right? So there are all kinds of new things that we do now at work because of the pandemic that we didn't do before, because we understand equity differently.
Yeah.
So it has to be a move. I mean, you said at the very beginning, culture is, first of all, we said culture will happen whether you're paying attention or not, and that it is a constant day-to-day, again, that hineni practice. I often say it takes constant attention and intention, but it doesn't actually have to feel like a lot of work, and it does become organic. Thank you. It does begin to become organic. You build muscles around it. So that, as I was talking before about the ways that I've learned to walk into a room with an equity lens I never had before, that's a muscle I built. It wasn't there a few years ago. And it's just that practice of doing it again and again, especially when it comes to those things that feel scary and uncomfortable because we don't have enough money, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough people. It is a certain amount of trust. And, in this room, I think we can probably say faith, that we're going to lean into the best of us as humans, and that is going to actually yield the best of us as organizations. Any last piece of advice that you want to offer to people in the room?
Nap more.
Amen.
Yes, my friend.
Go on more walks.
Nap more, walk more. I love that. Nourish, nap, hydrate,
Yeah.
move.
Yeah.
I would say focus without tokenizing. So there's a way to gather people's lived experiences without assuming that Whitney can represent every single Black person on the planet. Fun fact, I cannot. It's on my resume, but I cannot. So there is a way. The disability rights community has a saying, nothing about us without us.
Yes.
And so if you are like, I would like to diversify the staff. Well, first of all, I'm not a diversity hire. And so be sure about what it is that you actually want and need in your organization, and then gather the information necessary without tokenizing that person.
And I would close with, ask. Like, go ask the people. First of all, we are happy to talk to you as well. There are many other people present in this community that we've built here yesterday and today who are doing incredible culture work in their organization. So, ask and understand that it's not, we don't, we also close all of our trainings with lo lecha hamachad ligmor, right? Like we're not here to finish the work, but we can't desist from it. And so trust that like one movement, one first thing is enough, and they will build on each other. And really don't be afraid to ask the things that you don't know of the people who are out there doing this work. There's also just an enormous amount online. I just want to share that like the world of work globally is changing dramatically. And I am often heartened by everything that I read. I'm like, yes, we're doing that. We're teaching that. Okay, we're doing okay, So just begin to just take one tiny little action toward change and growth in this area. And we can all, I think, promise you it builds on itself. Thanks.